You're listening to Jay's Analysis, integrating film, philosophy, geopolitics, literature, history, economics, intrigue, and espionage, only at jaysanalysis.com. And now, Jay's Analysis Podcast, with your host, Jay Dyer.
Welcome, you're listening to Jay's Analysis. Dr. Joseph P. Farrell joins me again. I had the honor and pleasure of meeting Dr. Farrell in person last year at the Secret Space Program Conference in Texas, and at that time I was able to get a hold of his latest book, The Third Way, The Nazi International and the European Union and Corporate Fascism. And this is a really good book, and I thought it would be very timely given the fact that I'm 3 lectures deep into Quigley and his monumental tome, Tragedy and Hope, and much tie-in, much similarity and congruence, might we say convergence, since convergence is an appropriate term for this kind of plan. And so why don't you tell us maybe first, Dr. Farrell, what prompted this book given the other books?
Well, this book, some of the research that is in The Third Way, I'd actually uncovered way back when I did Reich of the Black Sun and then Nazi International. So I had some of that research for years, and I didn't think that putting it all into Nazi International, would be too much for people to really absorb. And I thought there was more to the story, too, than what I had uncovered back then. So I just kind of tabled it and decided, if I found out more information about some of this stuff, I'd go ahead and do another book on it. And that, in fact, happened, and I did The Third Way.
All right, let's talk about what is the third way. I mean, we're going to get, I'm sure, pretty deep, but what do you mean by this?
Well, the third way is actually a term, if you go back to the Nazi International book, it's a term that was used by people like Juan Perón. Muammar Gaddafi referred to this as well in some of his writings back in his terrorist phase, that basically refers to the idea that with 2 power blocks, communism and Western finance capitalism, you had to create a third block in between these 2, for them, extremes, as a kind of mediating synthesis of the 2, and hence you get National Socialism. And this, in fact, if you look at the documents I put in The Third Way, this is, in fact, particularly the document called the Madrid Circular, this is basically what they're advocating. And it's very interesting to me that Perón really is the first one to articulate this as a kind of geopolitical philosophy. And he's doing this at the time, of course, he's taking in all these Nazis in Argentina.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that is interesting because we tend to think of, dialectics and either or. And I remember a few years ago I was looking at what's public at the CFR archives, and I wrote an article about how the OSS was involved in training Mao's guerrillas.
Yes.
And if you look at the CFR archives, they discuss a kind of split back in the 40s between a kind of Dulles pro-Nazi CIA faction of the CFR, and then you had this kind of Alger Hiss pro-Soviet convergence idea. So You're saying that, well, it's not just Hiss and members of the CFR. This is kind of a shared idea, really, that's going on in the background, perhaps by bigger players.
Yes. And it's very interesting to me that you bring up the CFR archives and their actual collaboration with the Maoists in China, because at the very end of The Third Way, I put in a chapter about Senator McCarthy, because it has always fascinated me. I'm from South Dakota, and Senator Munt, one of the Republican senators that voted not to censure Joseph McCarthy in that famous censure vote, was still a sitting senator when I was a little boy. I remember him very well. And you didn't have the McCarthy as the icon of all that's evil in the world, that you get in certain quarters. So I put this chapter in the third way because it's always fascinated me that at that time in American history, you had all of these congressional committees, and they're all looking at various aspects of penetration of the federal government.
Hmm.
McCarthy being the most famous example, but House Un-American Activities Committee, the Kefauver Committee with the mafia,
Hmm.
and then, of course, you have that dirty deal that Allen Dulles made with General Galen and
Exactly. Yeah.
rolling the whole Nazi intelligence apparatus into the CIA.
Right.
And it's always struck me that there's never been a comprehensive history of why is it that all of these committees are going on at the same time,
Hmm.
and what may really be the case. And I think you fingered it right there, is that there's some sort of uh, background factional infighting going on between this pro-Soviet consolidation CFR crowd and the Allen Dulles, Sullivan and Cromwell, he and his brother crowd in the State Department and the CIA.
Hmm.
So, I put it in there just to kind of see if people would follow that up, provide a few clues. And so far, no one has. But I think it's a legitimate point because Senator McCarthy, of course, fingered very quickly in his government operations subcommittee the whole Institute of Pacific Relations,
Yes.
which is, of course, staffed by a lot of CFR people. You
And
had
Rockefellers, right?
and the Rockefeller Foundations and so on. The Reese Committee, another famous committee that I examine in the Common Core book that's coming out, dealing with the foundations and the philosophy that they're trying to sponsor in American education. So you've got all of this stuff going on, and I think what we really need is kind of a scholarly look at that period of American history and all these committees, which I don't think anybody's done, to my knowledge.
Let's
But
talk about the origin of the EU. The EU has obviously been big in the news given Brexit. I did hear some of your recent discussions of Brexit and what it means and signifies. And if we look at the EU, of course, this goes back to ideas certainly prior to the 40s, but at least a comprehensive presentation at Bilderberg in the 40s with the idea of let's put together a European common market.
Right.
Now, you talk about the European common market early on in the book, around page 40 or 41, and you talk about Russia and Mitteleuropa. And now, what is this apocalyptic struggle against the Slavs? How does that play into this?
Well, there's a lot going on here with the European Union. If you look at it in a certain way, this has been going on ever since the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. But in more modern times, you had Napoleon Bonaparte, of course, trying to create his continental system. You certainly had, as I go into in the third way, you had as German war aims shortly after World War I broke out, the idea that they were going to try, if they won the war, to create this European common market and dominate Central Europe and expand eastward. In the Nazi version, you have this tied, of course, with the idea of two things: the Nazi expansion to the east to acquire Lebensraum. But it's also very interesting to me that in 1942, and I put a picture of the cover of this, the front page title piece of this particular book that was published in Berlin. It was a study that was sponsored by the Reichsbank under the presidency of Walter Funk, the German economics minister, and in conjunction and with the sponsorship of I.G. Farben.
Yes.
So they got all these academics together to look at how they were going to set up a European common market. And there's two things that emerged in their studies, that actually several, that you can look at this document and see the duplication almost exactly in detail in the current structure of the EU. But I want to focus on three things in particular that they wanted to do. The first was when Italy and Germany signed the Axis Pact, they set up a committee of lawyers, essentially, to amalgamate German and Italian law, specifically and particularly with respect to patent law. All right. So in other words, this is the first thing that they wanted to do, is harmonize law. But, well, how do you do that with such very different cultures and histories and so on? So the second thing that the Nazis recommended, this to me is the clincher right here. They wanted to create a regulatory bureaucracy of essentially unelected commissars, or commissioners as they're called in Europe now, that would regulate and through regulation, bypass sitting national legislatures and simply disseminate regulations that everybody had to obey. The third thing they wanted to do was they wanted to set up an exchange rate mechanism for all European currencies and tie them to a fixed rate of fluctuation, a peg, to the Reichsmark. Well, lo and behold, after German reunification, thank you, Helmut Kohl, we get the phenomenon. It was actually before him, but it really kind of took off under German reunification. They set up what was called an exchange rate mechanism, and this was a mechanism that existed before the current euro, where the currencies, essentially of Middle Europa again, were all pegged to the German Deutschmark.
Right.
So that you had the Danish kroner, you had the Dutch guilder, the Austrian shilling, and so on. They were all coupled to the Deutschmark and allowed to fluctuate, but only within certain narrow bands. And when they got outside those bands, the Bundesbank, the German central bank, had to step in and bring those currencies back into those regions and stabilize the currency. It got interesting when France entered that arrangement under Kohl and Valéry Giscard d'Estaing, and essentially what that did was France basically capitulated, and you had financial and economic policy being made in Germany through the Bundesbank. When that didn't work, they set up the EU, and what did they do? They went to the Nazi plan of 1942.
Well, this is the next question I had, was that Quigley presents different continental bloc models,
right,
by both the Axis and the Allied powers. Now,
right,
Quigley says that after World War I, the reparations were such that Germany was more or less basically backed into a corner,
yes,
and that the erection of the dollar-based Bretton Woods system was intended as a kind of monetary excommunication of Germany, especially through free trade. Now, what's interesting is that both models include free trade and include continental blocks and are a form of Reich, but be it the Axis Atlanticist or excuse me, the Axis powers or the Western Atlanticist powers. So what I'm wondering is, if now both of these plans include this continental bloc,
right?
How do you see? Is it because we have these, say, at the beginning of the BIS with the Nazi banker running the BIS at the beginning? Is what's going on here?
Well, I think that's a really good question. I think what you're looking at is, again, more common cause over the short to mid-term by two blocs or deep state elites, the German, Nazi Reich elite, the big corporations, in Germany that essentially run their corporations as cartels. And we've seen a recent example of this with Dyer trying to take over Monsanto in this country. This has always been kind of the German model of big corporate industrial capitalism. So it's very powerful, in other words, in the German deep state. And by the same token, if you look at the arrangements that corporations have in Imperial Germany, this carries on into the Weimar Republic throughout the Third Reich, and then becomes part of German policy in West Germany. You have this very tight relationship between the state and the corporations, and all three are involved, even at the board level in corporations, particularly the labor unions, in coordinating everything. So German industry is very, very heavily subsidized by the government and vice versa.
Right.
I think what you have, therefore, Jay, is you have the Sullivan and Cromwell crowd, Averell Harriman, John J. McCloy, and all of these people who look at this bloc in Europe and they realize they've got to do two things. They've got to dominate it. Let's not have another world war because of this tiny little country with this enormous industrial plant. It's easier to do that by locking it into an arrangement where it surrenders some of its sovereignty to a regional bloc, which the United States, in their thinking, can dominate. And this, I think was ultimately the reasoning behind NATO. Zbigniew Brzezinski admits as much in the Grand Chessboard.
Right.
But on the Nazi side, they're looking at it from completely a different point of view, because for them, this is a way to establish German domination in Europe without having to fight a war, to do it through these types of regulation institutions, to do it through amalgamation of law, to do it through the coupling of the currency to the German economy, which you certainly see in Europe today. So you've got both of these things, I think, working in the background, and they're not always going to be working together, and I think we see that happening now. I think Merkel is kind of the last gasp of the Atlanticists. There's growing revolt in Europe and in Germany, and particularly Middle Europa, Germany and Austria-Hungary, essentially, to get themselves out from underneath this American influence and unipolarism. I think this is the reason that they're pushing so hard for a regional bloc military, to basically create a paper NATO, and it's really going to be the Europeans running the military, meaning France and Germany. So yeah, I think that's an excellent question. For me, it's an example of factional infighting. That's the bottom line.
Let's get your comment on this. Quigley's thesis of Hitler is a little muddled at times because he goes into depth discussing the industrialists funding Hitler. And he also has this really curious section about the Cliveden set in London, particularly the Astors and round table groups, that they were very pro-Hitler. Now, this is mainstream news now, of course, that members of the British aristocracy were pro-Hitler, but Quigley paints it as a time where right before the war, the Cliveden set was pro-Hitler, but they were also running news to hype up the war with Hitler. So, in your opinion, what level of coordination and cooperation do we see in the background of the British aristocracy, or this faction of the British aristocracy at least, with pro-Hitlerism and so forth, or was this a ruse? We think of Hess's flight to Scotland and how some have posed the thesis that perhaps Hess was actually a British mole. And Quigley talks about members of Hitler's cabinet regularly gallivanting with the Cliveden set, sipping champagne and so forth.
Joachim von Ribbentrop, was certainly one of them. That's a very interesting, and it's a very delicate question. And I have to be honest, I don't go into that question in the third way. Maybe someday I'll get around to writing a book about it. I don't know, but off the top of my head, my thought about that relationship between the Cliveden set, Salisbury Group, all of that stuff going on in Great Britain has always been, yes, they're backing Hitler, but for the very simple reason that he is going to revivify the German economy. They've pumped lots of money into it and nothing's happening because the Germans can't come up with a stable government. They've got the communists, they're worried about that, and nationalization of industry and loss of all their investments. So they're doing that, I think, simply to get that money flow going again and getting the economies off the ground, But the deeper question here is, did they do this, and did they hype up the war for some other long-term agenda?
Right.
And I think the answer there is yes, and it's the answer that is kind of implied in the research of Anthony Sutton.
Yes.
You have, with the Bolshevik state in Russia, you have a state that, number one, has turned its back basically on any sort of connection with Western values other than Marxism, and what it's embodying there is not a really very good version of it in some respects. But you also have at that time, you have the Communist International, the idea that the Soviet Union is going to sweep into Europe with its massive industrialization that the Bolsheviks began. And I think part of this is the age-old British Atlanticist fear of a major Asian bloc dominating the world. And the only country, by far, that was in a position militarily, economically, and geopolitically to deal with Russia was Germany.
Right.
The Russians surrendered in World War One. It was just a bad war from beginning to end for them. And in World War II, we know, that the Wehrmacht went all the way to Stalingrad and considerably.
Let me ask you this, because it seems that Quigley poses this, and this is kind of what we get out of the Great Game, and even Friedman at Stratfor has talked about how the 20th century politics could be summed up in basically making sure that there's no alliance between Germany and Russia. And then the subsequent weakening of those countries through the exportation of Bolshevism by what Sutton argues, or perhaps the weakening of Russia by this cabal in the background. The weakening of Germany by the cabal in the background that's pro-Hitler, perhaps, who wanted a war to weaken them. And just a little side note, Quigley argues that was what happened to Italy. He says that the British intelligence, I believe he says, flew... he's talking about Spain. He says that British intelligence flew Franco into Spain.
Yes.
And that the British thought that this would be a good way to weaken weaken Spain, if I recall. I may be fuzzy on that, but I believe that's what he says.
Mm-hmm. Well, I don't recall exactly what he says there either myself, but I do think that this thesis that the deeper agenda that you had within the Cliveden set and their American cousins to weaken both Russia and Germany by a huge war is part of the game plan. Yeah. I don't think that they predicted at all the extent to which Germany was successfully able to prosecute that war all the way up, till about the midpoint of Operation Barbarossa. Mm-hmm. I don't think they were expecting the quick collapse of France. I certainly don't think they were expecting the Germans to invade Norway and, all the other things that they did. That was the surprise. And, at that point, they have to get the United States into the war because, they realize that neither England nor Russia on their own are going to be able to prosecute this to the end. Mm-hmm. I think that's underestimating the Russians. I think they were fully capable, but that was their reasoning. So, I think there's deeper agendas here, and this third way idea is really, in a certain sense, if you look at the timing of the Nazi documents that I put in the third way, it's almost as if they're waking up to that realization at some point during the war, because they're starting to plan. They see, we've been duped, we've got a nut in charge of the country, and, it's turning into military disaster. So, I think they start coming up with these plans. Well, we're going to play the game with them. Mm-hmm. And I think you see in the way that they prosecuted things at the end of the war and after the war, with the deals with American intelligence to keep the German intelligence network in place, with the deals that I definitely think they made to move all that loot into the Western banking system, with a marker that is going to come due at some point. Mm-hmm. I think all of this is part of their long-term game plan. So absolutely, I think you're correct here.
Well, I did find it. It's 597. He says, one of the chief figures in the conspiracy in England was Douglas Jerrold, a well-known editor who revealed in some detail in his autobiography that Major Hugh Pollard flew to the Canary Islands in order to transport Franco by plane to Morocco. Yeah. So once again, we see British intelligence in the background. With the fascists. I thought Britain stood for freedom and democracy.
They stand for freedom and democracy for themselves, not everybody else.
Hence Brexit, right?
Hence Brexit. Yeah, that's right.
Well, I like that point you made, that what could be in the background is certain business interests in that don't like bureaucratic EU regulation. That seems to make sense. Yeah. But back to the third way. Now, if you Google third way and convergence and all this stuff, you'll get Wikipedia in these articles, and you'll see Tony Blair and Bill Clinton as representatives shaking hands. You get BBC articles about this, and that's interesting because that would be relatively appropriate given that Quigley was Clinton's mentor, and there is an entire chapter in Tragedy and Hope. He doesn't explicitly use the term, but he does say that the government of the coming era, the future,
Mm-hmm.
the hope period that he's talking about, minus the tragedy, the coming hope period will be one of managerial rule by experts, bureaucrats,
Mm-hmm.
total socialist technocratic control. Now,
Mm-hmm.
Quigley has an entire chapter on that. So that is exactly what you're talking about with
Yeah,
the third way.
yeah, and this is exactly what the Nazi plan was that they detailed in 1942. It was essentially rule by technocrats, by managers, by lawyers, by commissars, and so on and so forth. But the really interesting thing to me here is, okay, guys, we've had for about 30 years now you globalists running things. We've got your free trade agreements. We've got all of these blocks going on. And Mr. Rockefeller thinks it's a wonderful idea that the world be run by altruistic bankers like himself. Well, what a wonderful track record that they have of bringing peace and prosperity to the world so far. Nobody other that I can think of, other than maybe Mr. Putin and the Prime Minister of Hungary, has been challenging this globalist dogma that we're going to be able to get along in a corporately run multicultural world. And the Brits have finally had it. And I think this is interesting because if you look at Britain now reacting to the EU, I have to wonder, Jay, if maybe they're not only reacting out of pure cultural self-interest or even business interest. I mean, my word, how can you run a business with commissioners in Brussels mandating the size and curvature of bananas? Nutty stuff like this. You can't do it. And the other thing I have to wonder is there some awareness in the British deep state that what they're looking at in Europe is precisely this Nazi plan come to fruition, and they're cutting their losses and getting out of it now?
Well, I did a whole chapter in my book, and there's a piece at my website analyzing the latest Bond installment where
Mm-hmm.
you had that exact storyline. Now, the
Mm-hmm.
storyline centers around what they call the Nine Eyes security system, which is this kind of
Yep.
rough NSA GCHQ type thing,
Mm-hmm.
but could roughly be also applied to the political system of the European Union. And what happens? Well, if you don't go along, you get bombed by Spectre, and
Yeah.
Spectre's going, and that gets you in line. And then, of course, Spectre's in the background, having basically finagled their way into British intelligence
Yep.
and running this big, tech surveillance grid.
And it's interesting. Let me comment on just that aspect of things because I think you're right. You look at both versions of Spectre in the James Bond films, the recent one with Daniel Craig and Christopher Waltz playing the bad guy, and the earlier one with Donald Pleasance and some of the other actors that they got to play, Ernst Stavro Blofeld. Well,
Mhm.
why is the head of Spectre always a German, or an Austrian in Christopher Waltz's case?
Mhm.
And again, I think Ian Fleming knows something, and he's telling everybody something, and the British elite know that something too, and they don't want to play ball with it anymore because they've been losing. 2 world wars, the empire is no more. They're kind of a province off of Europe, and they want to get back in the global game. And there's no other way for them to do that than to cut loose of Brussels and
Well,
Berlin.
like you said, which that's basically having to listen to Washington secondhand.
Yeah, exactly,
Yeah.
exactly. So I think from their point of view, they've done the correct thing culturally, politically, economically, financially, and I think we're going to see we're seeing the reaction on Europe right now. I mean, Merkel, I saw her after the Brexit vote, and she just looked miserable. I mean, she looked more miserable than she normally does, and she could barely speak above a whisper.
Yeah.
So now, they're rolling out the European superstate big time. So this is again Berlin basically calling the shots, and sooner or later, I hate to tell everybody, this is going to rear its head and it's going to bite the USA too, and we're seeing it already happen. So yeah, I think third way here is exactly what's happening in Europe. There's no doubt in my mind, and there's no doubt in my mind that behind the scenes you have basically an unreconstructed fascist philosophy driving all of it.
Well, let me ask you this, because so would it be more appropriate? I'm not disagreeing with your thesis. I'm just wondering, is it just Fabian, or
I,
do you see it as a top-down fascist model and not a Fabian model?
I think it's a little bit of both, but in the final analysis, the fact of the matter is that policy and economic and military decisions are going to be driven by Germany, and that for one very simple reason. If you look at the size of the German economy,
Right,
it's number
right.
4 or 5 in the world, and it's on a population base of, 70 or 80 million people in a country the size of Oregon.
Mhm.
Um, this is, to my mind, this is the old strategic problem of the Kaiser with a vengeance. You've got this little powerhouse in the center of Europe, and it's going to drag everybody along one way or the other. And so long as you've got that kind of mentality in Germany, and you've got equally in France, you've got the old École d'État in France training all these big state bureaucrats to run all of this stuff for France and now Europe. The mentality is there that it's mostly top down. Um, and you're seeing the pushback to this where the socialism in Southern Europe has always been kind of bottom up.
Mhm.
You're getting that pushback in Italy now in a major way. It's been there in Greece, and the poor Greeks, can't really do anything about it because they're not powerful enough. You've got the same thing in Spain. So, I think they're clamping down this big super state in a rush to make sure nobody else is able to leave. And
Mhm.
it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out.
Are we looking at an attempt to? Well, I like that you talk about Schacht and Montague Norman, and that
Hmm.
ties in very intimately with the discussions that Quigley has,
Yep,
precisely because the chief member states of the Bank for National Settlements were the big Western powers, and
yep,
the top dog at that time, with the New York Federal Reserve, was of course the Bank of England and Montague Norman.
right.
And so, what economically, what are we looking at here with, in other words, why are we on the dollar-based system? Is it simply because the UK economy was too weak after the wars to really become a powerhouse, and just the
Right.
natural resources of the US functioned as the means by which to utilize basically America's wealth and resources as the engine of the Atlantis' economic powerhouse?
Yeah, they had to because you've got again from the traditional British and American geopolitical Atlanticist perspective, you've got this powerhouse in Russia that's now injected itself into half of Europe and stayed there. You also have a population base, therefore, in the Soviet Union that is able to sustain a major global effort. You've got the industrial base, you've got the technological base. So Great Britain cannot do it on its own, and therefore you do have to move things to a dollar reserve status. But Britain, I think, Jay, in all honesty, when you're talking about these huge long-term historical movements in the 20th century, Britain really did not come out of World War One in good shape. I mean,
That's what
they
Quigley
had
says, right?
yeah, they had just they had basically laid siege to the Central Powers for 4 years and gotten nowhere,
Hmm.
and spent rivers of blood and immense amounts of treasure and indebted themselves to the United States, and then make the matter worse by imposing reparations on Germany that the Germans can't possibly pay. So I think the Bretton Woods thing is all kind of a reaction in part to the bitter experience of World War One and realizing they can't do that again.
Hmm.
It's also, I think, a kind of interesting scheme to make the United States bear the burden
Hmm.
now of the military effort of,
Yes,
of
exactly.
containment.
Right. So, we are looking at uh, a Mackinder style land power, sea power battle here.
Yeah, I think so. Yes, I do, and that's what has them so upset. To extend this even more from World War II into modern times. I think this is what has them so upset about the emergence of China's plans for the Silk Road and all of that
Hmm.
infrastructure that they want to develop in Central Asia and so on in conjunction with Russia. They are terrified of that bloc, and The United States doesn't appear to be able to handle any of this now. So Britain's cutting itself loose, in my opinion, for yet another reason. I think they're going to play the soft power card, and they're going to play it very well. They're going to revivify the Commonwealth. It was amazing to me, almost hours after the Brexit vote was done, and it was clear that the vote had been to leave, Australia and New Zealand are lining up to cut some deals. So, there's the Commonwealth in action, and that would be a global bloc, and it would be a counterpoise both to Berlin and a counterpoise to Washington.
Mhm.
So I think they've put themselves over the long term into a very nice position.
One of the more obscure things going in the background that you've written many books on is the secret technology, hidden physics, and so forth in the background of the development of nuclear energy and so forth. And you talk about Iran and nuclear proliferation. Now, what's interesting is that, in Iran, prior to the coup of the CIA and MI6,
Mm-hmm.
you already have, British power, Anglo-American oil company, or Anglo-Iranian oil, right, basically running Iran.
Mm-hmm.
And then you have this coup. What does that signify in terms of, why is this such a big deal is what I'm getting at. Why?
Well, the post-war coups of the overthrow of King Farouk in Egypt
Mhm.
and the overthrow of Mossadegh in Iran, both, I think, in approximately the same time frame,
Yeah.
54, 53, somewhere in there. Americans have it in their heads that this was all just the CIA doing this. Well, the bad news is that the CIA's networks on the ground in those countries were Nazis. Okay, in other words, it's that post-war, what I've been calling Nazi International, with ties to German intelligence and all of that. These are the boots on the ground carrying out these coups for the CIA. Okay, so you have right there the injection.
You're saying Operation Ajax, right?
Yes, you're having the injection of these Nazi influences into those countries, and they're linking up with
Well, yeah,
radical Wahhabism.
and that would, as a tailored ideology, that would be perfect in Iranian theology or
Oh
in
yeah,
Iranian
absolutely.
mindset. And this is also, as you point out in your book, why you've got Hitler meeting with the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and so forth.
Right.
So
And
it's part of the ideology of the anti-Zionist perspective that would be popular
yes.
in Iran and amongst Wahhabis, as you say.
And the other thing we have to remember is that German business with Iran between the wars was fairly substantial. They
That's what I
were,
was going to ask about.
yeah,
Is that where we're getting to the nuclear aspect? You've got a
yes,
section where you talk about the Shah and Helmut Schmidt.
yeah. A lot of Iran's nuclear technology came from West Germany or Germany. A lot of Iraq's, for that matter, did. Some of it from France. But the interesting thing, since you mentioned that, I had an emailed to me by a friend of mine in Germany about an article that just came out last week in Der Spiegel,
Mhm.
where German intelligence has identified Iranian firms attempting to purchase more nuclear and missile technology from Germany, which of course makes you wonder just what sort of nuclear technology the Germans really have.
Mhm.
So yeah, Iran is a player, but Germany is in the mix here once again because their businesses are so heavily penetrated in Iran. It's a lot of German and Russian technology that have gone into their nuclear program. And if you read the Third Way carefully, one of the things I point out is that Germany has the complete fuel cycle.
Mhm.
In other words, they could produce atomic bombs in a week if they wanted to. They probably have, in my opinion. So it is a de facto nuclear power, whether we want to admit it or not. And they have done this very carefully, as I pointed out in the book, by making these types of corporate arrangements with so-called pariah nations like Iran,
Mhm.
South Africa a few decades ago, where they source out all the technology that their treaty obligations forbid them from having on German soil.
Mhm.
So, this is the way they've dodged around this. They did this after World War I. They've done it after World War II. This is part of the consistent pattern. So yeah, Iran is definitely in the mix here. Germany played a major role in negotiating that deal with Iran that Secretary Kerry signed off on. So you can't discount them. You know, they are major movers and shakers on the global stage. And I'll be very blunt and honest and say I'm not terribly happy with the way they're moving and shaking on the world stage.
Well, I'm somewhat of a skeptic about Iran because I don't. I mean, certainly the apocalyptic ideology is
Yeah.
strange, but it seems to me that the West, and you can find this even in fairly recent mainstream news reports in the last 10, 20 years. I think Lou Dobbs even did a
Hmm.
report on the U.S.
Well, the International Atomic Energy
Yeah, right.
Commission did as well. Yeah, saying they're not making nuclear weapons. Um, Again, the important thing to remember is whether or not they can close the fuel cycle.
Hmm.
Once they close the fuel cycle, it's just like Japan. They start producing plutonium and tons of it, And once you've said that, it doesn't take much to see that can very easily and quickly be converted into working nuclear weapons. You just have the parts in the warehouse, machine them, and assemble the bomb, and off you go. And the Iranians are smart enough to assemble a bomb without having to test one. So I think there is a danger there, in spite of what's been said,
Well,
particularly given the ideology.
I guess what I'm thinking is some have written interesting theories or analyses that the proliferation of the AQCon nuke network and so forth. This is actually intended and part of
Yeah.
CIA strategy. There's not black markets of nukes out there that's
Hmm.
this is not happening outside of the purview of the Atlanticist establishment. Is what I'm trying to say.
Yeah, I would agree with that to a certain extent. The difficulty now is that you have this theory that there are these mini nukes out there. Well, if you have the technology to produce those, how do you really maintain your anti-proliferation efforts? That's a huge concern. But by the same token, I look at it both ways too, because you can't be Russia or China and really honest from their point of view and be happy with a nuclear Iran. So I think, as well as the CIA, you're going to have certain pressure from those countries to prevent that from happening.
Hmm. Does this factionalism apply to aspects of, say, the Brzezinski model, which is very critical of, say, Israel, and would be pro nuclear energy in Iran, like you mentioned with John Kerry?
Hmm.
Does this fit into that? How does that fit into this model of the international that you're speaking of? Because I get the impression that sometimes the outworkings don't seem to make sense on the surface. Why is part of the State Department pro Iran, and then at times not? Is that just that neocon warhawk faction that's vivid?
That's an excellent question, and I have to admit I haven't thought about that aspect of things. But if you want to go back to this long-term view that we're taking here, I would view that as yet another sign that you have some real deep factional fissures and cracks beginning to show themselves
Okay,
in the West.
right.
We're seeing this again. I think you see it very clearly in the Brexit vote with a certain segment of the British deep state, including the monarchy, for
Hmm.
crying out loud. That was more or less in favor of leaving, and then you had the globalist faction.
Hmm.
I think you're seeing that playing out in a number of areas and in a number of issues around the world, domestically in this country, and so on and so forth. I think these fissures are very deep, and I don't think, since we're talking about it, go back to that period in the 50s when you had all of these congressional committees investigating penetration of the federal government effectively. And they're all saying, well, we're noticing this, we're noticing that, but no one's comparing notes. And if you sit down and compare notes, what it looks like to me is you've got those two factions, the international socialist centralizers and the decentralizers, the Alan Dulles, fascism school. and they're fighting each other behind the scenes. I really think that something like that, or some offspring of those factions, is working itself out now in geopolitics. Because I'm as mystified as you.
Well, how real do you think the fight is? Is it one of those things where on the ground you've got Cold War types back in the Cold War, spy versus spy stuff that's real, but at the top you've got a lot of double dealing and because the roads seem to take us to the same destination. I think of like
Yeah.
the 1988 Malta meeting with John Paul II, Gorbachev, and Bush, which is engineered by the wise men of the West, so-called, these CFR guys. Is that what's going on here? You think is it? I guess it's just really about that long-term march to global government, really, right?
Yeah, I think it is. But again, I've always maintained that what you're looking at with these people is a mafia.
Yeah.
And the mafia is the mafia. Everyone wants to be in charge. I put it in my book in terms of the European Union is who gets to play Charlemagne. you know, and that's really what's going on here. It's all fine and dandy for everyone to talk about globalism and global village and so on and so forth, but who's going to be in the final analysis running the show?
Mm-hmm.
And when push comes to shove, the Asian bloc, the Russians and the Chinese, and maybe eventually even India, maybe even eventually Japan, are going to want to run the show. If you look at Europe, they're going to want to run the show. If you look at the United States and the British, they're going to want to run the show. So, yeah, global government's fine, but I think the closer they get to that goal, and part of it is even out of their hands, simply being driven by economic circumstances, technological circumstances, as they get closer and closer to the infrastructure that can make that happen, the fighting is only going to increase, not decrease.
Interesting. Well, let's talk a little bit. I don't want to give too much away because you have a really interesting thesis, but what hints can you give us about CERN? Now, CERN is everywhere. I've got two questions. First of all,
I knew that.
Why is CERN in the book? I know why, but readers might be surprised to find this nugget of a chapter here. And second question is, now this is just my suspicion, just intuition. I wonder if SETI, for example, is really about beaming things to aliens, emails to aliens, or
I wonder too.
Yeah, or is just my suspicion, was SETI just really part of the kind of global surveillance, NSA weaponization of basically the whole atmosphere? Is that really what SETI was a cover for? And what I want to know is what can you tell us about CERN, because this is in Europe? Obviously, a lot of esoteric symbology involved in CERN and speculations. What do you think?
Well, CERN stands for Conseil Européen Recherche Nucléaire, and the European Council for Nuclear Research. What it is in reality is it is a sovereign entity unto itself that was set up by the powers that created the common market, Germany, France, Italy, and so on, to research nuclear research. But here's the thing. As a sovereign entity, CERN can take out loans. It can in other words, function as its own financial institution. It can contract with anybody anywhere to build its equipment. Yeah. Where have we heard this before? Think I.G. Farben here. Farben's
the
gone
Vatican,
to the Vatican. CERN is the Templars. CERN. In other words, it's the Templars have gone nuclear here, folks. but anyway. In addition to this, CERN, what really intrigues me about CERN is the philosophical issue here. Because you're now dealing in so-called science with a contraption, a machine that some of these scientists writing about it are they're waxing religious. They're describing it in these, for me, terms that could be described as idolatrous.
Well, they're
Because,
dancing on stages. They put on
yeah,
performances in place with Masonic squares and compasses. They dance. What in the world?
and Shiva,
Yeah, right.
the statue of Shiva in front of the place, the Hindu god of destruction and creation. So yeah, they are literally playing God with this machine. Now, let's look at this from the philosophical and scientific point of view, because this is where, me with my little junior high school physics thing just can't make sense of what they're telling us. They're telling us that they're spinning particles around in this contraption and colliding them in order to create the conditions of matter in the first few picoseconds or so after the Big Bang. All right, well, fine, that sounds fun. And, but when you get right down to it, you look a little closer at quantum mechanics, and what particles are nothing but packets of mathematical description. So you've got a machine essentially whirling particles of mathematical information around and colliding them. Mm-hmm. And here's the thing that bothers me, Jay. As a sovereign entity, it controls all the data and who gets it. So in other words, unless you can build one of these contraptions yourself in your garage, you can't really check their results. Mm-hmm. That's philosophical problem number one. And I think this is ultimately why China wants to build one, because I think they're noticing some things that don't add up. And here's what I think they might be. If you step back from the public story of particle physics, and we're just playing around with little mathematical packets of information here, folks, nothing to worry about, nothing to be concerned about, and look at what this machine actually is. It's 5 particle accelerators, the last 2 of which, there's a proton synchrotron, which is a circular accelerator, and then you've got the Large Hadron Collider, the big 27-kilometer circumference collider underneath it. The proton synchrotron, if you drive an axis of rotation through the Large Hadron Collider, sits canted off the center of that and above it. So you've got two particle accelerators, and in the bottom one you've got particles being rotated in opposite directions. Okay? Mm-hmm. Now, to my mind, these two things, the opposite directions in the LHC, spell torsion. Mm-hmm. Okay? Not particles, torsion. Because that's what torsion is. It's a twist, a rotating twist in space-time. Just which
you've written about.
I've written about in the Nazi Bell thing. And if you look at the proton synchrotron that injects the protons stream into the LHC, this is canted off and above, as I said, the LHC. So you could actually create a kind of magnetic, to my way of thinking, if you played with the sequencing of the magnetic firing properly, you could actually trigger a kind of magnetic proton synchrotron wobble in all of this. All right. And on top of all of this, let's remember 2 final things. The magnets in these accelerators are several times more powerful than the local magnetic field there in Switzerland of planet Earth. So in other words, I'm looking at this thing from a simple, let's look at the machine itself versus what they're telling us about the machine. Mm-hmm. And what the machine itself looks to me like is it's a machine that could possibly have planetary resonance effects when it's in use. And lo and behold, what do we see people noticing whenever CERN is turned on? Well, funny cloud formations. We notice, certain things going on in the sun, according to some people, and so on and so forth. So let's look at another aspect of CERN. The largest generator of data in the world, of raw computer data, and the largest user of the internet in the world is CERN. Mm-hmm. The computers are programmed to pick anomalous events or predicted events according to the mathematics out of the billions of bits of data that are created every second. And those bits of data are then forwarded to the scientists for analysis.
Mm-hmm.
I suspect that this means at a deeper level, you might have a second set of computer algorithm filters to pull anomalous data that doesn't fit their model and shunt it to, let's just be honest, secret committees to see what they can make of this anomalous data. And I strongly suspect that some of that data, secondary secret filter, may concern data correlations of when that machine is turned on and what's happening in the planet, maybe even what's happening in human behavior.
That's what I was going to say. Yeah. I wondered, just speculating, could it be a form of advanced supercomputer, quantum computer, something that might relate to the same types of things that we see Google and the NSA attempting to do with predictive algorithms and so forth, and maybe even, like you say, something beyond that, Tesla style, with, I don't know, the noosphere.
All of it. In other words, I think this could be a huge social engineering psychophysics experiment, if you want to use that expression. It could be a huge data correlation expression. In other words, we've got a machine with potential planetary resonance effects, in my opinion, and therefore you're going to want to do data correlations of other things happening geophysically on Earth, maybe human behavior, maybe even resonance effects with the sun, because the Earth's magnetic field is coupled to that of the sun.
So, say a series of patterns that might occur during some celestial or stellar phenomenon, and how there might be a correlation on a deeper level. Is that what you're saying here?
Yeah, let's say you turn CERN on and you collide your protons or your lead ions or whatever it is you're colliding during the day. And when it's turned on and you're doing your collisions, solar activity dips or bumps up. Or let's say there are earthquakes, an increase in the frequency and intensity of earthquakes, and so on and so forth. In other words, that's what I mean by data correlation. Is there a corresponding noticeable change in aggregate human behavior, noticeable in markets or something?
So that would require the internet data you're talking about, right?
Yeah, it would require the internet data. That would require precisely what you're suggesting, the NSA, the supercomputers, the surveillance and everything like that. I think this is a huge project. I call it the cosmology cartel.
Right.
And I suspect, again, Jay, that if this were just about particle physics, spending billions of dollars for simply investigating, a purely theoretical model
of the Big Bang,
well, that's nice that we can do that. And if that's all that were being done, why would the Chinese want to spend the money in their failing economy and build one of their own? My suspicion here is that the sheer size of the effort, the sheer expenditure involved in not only building but maintaining and operating this machine is indicative of a military budget.
Yeah, absolutely.
And what is, of extreme interest to me is that one of the people that was there at the creation of CERN itself, the entity in 1957, was a Nazi lawyer by the name of Walter Hallstein. His signature's right on it. And this guy was the principal, one of the principal advisors, not only to Chancellor Adenauer, the first post-war chancellor. He was right in there all the way up to Willy Brandt. And this is the guy that came up with the idea, if we're going to have a European Union, we need to do this all by regulation and amalgamate patent law. In other words, this is the guy that was one of the brains behind what you see in the EU, and he's creating CERN. Now, I don't know about you, but a Nazi involved in all of this project kind of makes me a little uneasy.
Well, this is all based, as you've said in several books, alternate physics that's not mass consumption Newtonian atomism.
Right.
So I could see that, but let me get a little clarification. What might this do? So that's a great explanation. What's the advantage of this thing? What's the mechanization or what does it do? What's the doohickey do?
All right. If you leave the particle physics explanation out of the picture for a moment, let me go back to one of my favorite characters in science engineering. All right, we're not talking physics theory anymore. We're talking engineering nuts and bolts technology. His name was Gabriel Krohn.
Yes, I remember. Yeah.
He was a Hungarian electrical engineering genius. Is what he was. He published in 1935, and I've talked about this in Secrets of the Unified Field. He published in 1935 a little paper that won him the Montefiore Prize at the University of Liège in Belgium. And what did he say in the paper? Well, he said that this tensor calculus stuff is really cool. we can use it to explain the transient anomalies and phase creep and so on and so forth that we electrical engineers notice in our electrical systems, particularly large rotating ones.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what he's just told you, if you really get right down to it, is he's, number one, said tensor calculus uses hyperdimensional mathematics to describe any electrical circuit. Any electrical circuit is a hyperdimensional machine. In other words, it's affecting not just these three dimensions, but all the other mathematical dimensions, all right? And it can only be described by that kind of hyperdimensional mathematics. Secondly, that means that with 1935 technology, you could build a machine, conceivably, that would have an effect on higher dimensions and possibly be able to gate energy into these three dimensions. So in other words, imagine the military applications of this. It's huge.
Mm-hmm.
Potentially you're dealing with a set of implications that would make, as I've said many times, would make a hydrogen bomb look like a firecracker. So if you build it big enough
mm-hmm.
and put enough magnetic juice into it, you've got a planetary machine that has the potential, in my opinion, of being used in one of two ways, either as one whale of a weapon if you figure out how to control these hyperdimensional effects, or you've got a machine that you could conceivably use as a doomsday weapon, quite literally, to destroy the planet. And why do I say that? Well, one of the concerns about CERN was that the physicists themselves were interested in the idea of creating the quark gluon plasma, or strangelets as they're sometimes called. Well, a quark gluon plasma is kind of the quantum mechanics equivalent of gray goo in nanotechnology. In other words, it's matter that draws other matter to itself and transforms it into itself. So in other words, it's kind of a particle version of a mini black hole. And there was concern out there amongst some scientists in Europe that said, well, if you create these things, you could conceivably destroy the planet. And they actually attempted to shut CERN down. And lo and behold, they couldn't in German courts or American courts. Because why? Well, because CERN's a sovereign entity, just like the Bank of International Settlements.
Mm-hmm.
So on and on the nightmare goes. And, why would China want to build one of these things and an even bigger version of it? And I'm thinking, well, the Chinese are not doing this just so that they can investigate theoretical physics. They've got their mathematicians that can tell them about all this stuff. They don't have to build a big machine to test it.
Well, what about, could it just be advanced energy or a form of free energy that would be cartelized by this? Energy is a big player in this, as you've said, with nuclear power and so forth.
But let's stop it again and think. If you create a machine that gives you actual access to engineerable 0-point energy, imagine weaponizing that. So in other words, I'm viewing this, bottom line here, I'm viewing CERN in a completely different way admittedly, than the public story of particle physics.
Right, right.
I think this is an attempt to build a gateway hyperdimensional electromagnetic technology to access all of this stuff.
Interesting. With multiple potential uses then, right?
Yep,
Okay,
absolutely.
I see. That is very unique. I've not heard that, and I've heard everything but that analysis. Now, I know this is kind of you need to speak of the conspiracy mill, which is appropriate for CERN. And one of the things that we've seen bouncing around the conspiracy mill that really kind of struck me as pretty profound was the Gotthard Tunnel, and we saw. Now, does this relate? Now, I mean, maybe I'm getting too fringe and out there. I did an interview with Sophia Smallstorm about underground bases, and yeah, I know that's a perennial conspiracy internet topic, but it's very real. There are
Yes.
underground bases. So while we're out here on the fringe, how do you think that the underground tunnels and bases? Why have a big occult ceremony, celebrating this? How does that tie in, or does it?
I think it does. I mean, let's be very frank here. It fits a historical pattern. Go back to what I wrote about the Nazi Bell in SS Brotherhood of the Bell.
Mm-hmm.
One of its project's names, code names, was Projekt Laternenträger, lantern bearer. Well, what's a lantern bearer? It's a light bearer.
Mm-hmm.
What's a light bearer? It's Lucifer.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's a cult. One of the top scientists involved with the Bell was Hermann Oberth, the rocket guy,
Mm-hmm.
who had huge occult interests. Many people don't know this about him, but he was another Rudolf Hess. He was very deeply suffused with that mentality.
Right.
And so, putting statues of Shiva up and having Hindu dances of the creation and destruction of the world by Shiva when you're dedicating CERN doesn't surprise me.
Mm-hmm.
I think there is something to the idea that they could be attempting through technological means to invoke what they consider to be higher powers. But let's go further. You mentioned the Gotthard Tunnel. Jay, right now we're in the 100-year anniversary, right now, this month, of the Battle of the Somme in World War I. And of course, earlier this year, Verdun. Well, Chancellor Merkel and Francois Hollande met at Verdun, where, again, the leadership treated us to yet another one of these pagan festivals.
Right.
And I'm thinking, how dare you besmirch the memory of those Frenchmen and those Germans who had no inkling or even remote inclination to be a part of something like that. They were fighting essentially for what they understood as their Christian civilization.
Mm-hmm.
And now, with the Gotthard Tunnel, we have yet another pagan ceremony that's supposed to be really meaningful and symbolic because these people are so danged afraid of invoking anything from Europe's traditional and historical past. Now, to me, what this signals, and we had that story recently about, somebody wanting to build a temple to Baal in New York City, and,
right.
They decide, well, maybe that's not a good idea right now. Well, to me, this is just a signal that this power elite quite literally is nuts. I mean, they are playing around with symbolism, trying to invoke evil, and like C.S. Lewis said, if you call high heaven down on your heads, it may answer. So what I think they're doing is they're revealing who they are and what they're up to and what they want.
Mm-hmm.
And that should disturb everybody, whether or not they're trying to do it through CERN or otherwise. Just the symbolism of it itself should tell you that these people are not, nor do they view themselves as, being a part of this culture that has been built up so painstakingly over the centuries. I don't see any other way to evaluate them.
Does the splitting of the atom and the releasing of energy through this echo a kind of ritual action of inversion in terms of creation or matter or prima materia and so forth?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So when we think of, say, an esoteric or magical context where we're, transferring energy on the levels of the psychosphere, is that where we would be? That's what the rituals are at least intended to do.
Yeah. Well, let's go back to what we said about CERN earlier, with the fear that some people had that this machine would create strangeness, the quark gluon plasma, the state of matter that existed picoseconds after the Big Bang. Well, what are you really saying when you're trying to create that? You're trying to create the materia prima.
Hmm.
You're trying to create the philosopher's stone. And they made a big hullabaloo about the Higgs boson and, the so-called God particle and all the nonsense in their constant pantheon of multiplying gods and particles. I look at it, yeah, there is an occult aspect to this. I said it in Grid of the Gods. Modern science
Right.
appears to be nothing but a technique to bring the magic of the gods to fruition,
Yeah.
if you look at it.
Right.
And with the occult rituals surrounding it, they're telling us this effectively. I don't think you need to go any further than that. You don't need to get into nutty theories about Bible and Revelation and invoking demons from Saturn and so on and so forth. You don't even need to go that far. Just look at the symbolism that they surround themselves with and that they've surrounded their machine with,
Mhm.
and the religious language in which they use to describe all of this.
And it would be characterized as essentially Promethean, would you say, or how would you characterize it?
Oh, that's giving Prometheus kind of a bad name. I mean, I would say no. It's hyper Promethean. It's way beyond anything that Prometheus is doing. This is not just a revolt against the gods. It's an attempt to summon primordial forces and bend them.
Mm-hmm.
Invoking the imagery of the accelerator,
Mm-hmm.
bend them, to human will. And that hasn't turned out too good, too good in the past. There's a reason they're doing all of this, and I think they're telling us in the symbolism that they surround themselves with.
Mm-hmm. What about underground bases? Does that tie in?
Yeah, I think it does.
Okay.
Yeah, because, well, CERN itself is underground.
Mm-hmm.
All of those big magnetic machines are underground and embedded in a nonlinear morass of rock, which is, to me, is kind of interesting. It takes me back to pyramid thinking.
Mm-hmm.
But I look at the underground base thing here, Jay, as literally in a very similar way that Richard Dolan does, because you're looking at a separate infrastructure that's living a kind of parasitical life on its host countries.
Is it a form of breakaway civilization, basically?
Yeah, I that's exactly what I think it represents.
Okay.
And since you raised the topic, I'm going to crawl way out onto the end of the twig here of speculation, far beyond the weight of any evidence, and tell you that I suspect strongly that we're looking at a consistent pattern here. Because what did the Nazis do? Well, they built a lot of underground stuff.
Right.
And in that underground stuff, they built a lot of other secret stuff, and they used human slave labor to do it. I strongly suspect that there is a relationship between the massive amount of underground bases, not only in this country, but others,
Right.
and the disappearance of people, of children. I think something's going on in this connection. I think they're tapping into a labor pool that is entirely secret because, after all, they've signaled what they are. They're completely amoral, and they'll do anything for power.
Yeah.
And, that's my suspicion.
As you know, talk a lot about movies. Two films that come to mind right away in regard to that. Temple of Doom, the Kali cult, the Thuggy cult, has an underground slave labor compound.
Yep.
Mining for metals and so forth.
Metals.
And then on top of that, the Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Yep.
We see Nazis in underground bases.
Yep. Yep.
And then, well, I guess in the third one you have Templars and
Templars,
right,
and the Grail, and all of this.
all that stuff.
Yeah. I think there's definitely a connection here. There's no doubt in my mind. I have no evidence for it. Oddly, anybody investigating these stories of child sex rings and human trafficking and slavery usually end up dead. Um, there's no doubt in my mind that there's human sacrifice going on with some of these rings, and that it may be taking place in some of these underground bases, and you know, for all of the standard occult reasons.
Mm.
Um, there's too much of it. And when you see the pattern appearing over and over in the same way, that to me says, once is odd, two's a coincidence, but more than two, there's a pattern. And that means somebody or something is behind it.
Well, I remember I came across a set 1970s Rand Corporation plan.
Mm-hmm.
It's now public. You can find it
Mm-hmm.
about building using nuclear energy to drill
Mm-hmm.
to build high speed underground rails.
Mm-hmm.
For presumably extensive lengths,
Mm-hmm.
and that would make sense because then you could, uh, you know, if you're say Kissinger, you could be could be in one end of the country, and then in the other end a couple hours later, right?
Exactly. And it's a nice way to have hidden commerce.
Mm-hmm.
It would be a wonderful way to have a hidden system of finance, which I definitely think exists.
Mm-hmm.
You could move goods and services in your nice little breakaway civilization thing around, with no one being the wiser.
Basically, a black market wet dream.
Yeah, exactly. Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly.
All right. Well, I don't want to keep you too long.
You're not keeping me. I'm good.
So after the CERN chapter, we get to your conclusions. I don't want to reveal too much because I want people, to get the book and to read it. I think they'll get a lot of information that you're not going to find anywhere else. I'll put it that way. And it really does coalesce well with Quigley.
Mm-hmm.
Where are we going? Is a good way to put it. What patterns and trends can we look for? You talk about this a lot at your YouTube channel, News and Views,
Mm-hmm.
Nefarium. What are we looking at here? Where are we headed?
I really think you're headed for the creation now of three blocks. I think you're going to see Orwell's Oceania
Mm-hmm.
and Europa and Asia manifest themselves.
Okay.
But they're going to manifest themselves, and I think they already have been for quite some time, in the form of what I call factional infighting. In other words, I view the news stories when I see these contradictory news stories coming out of the same elites. I look at it and say that's the factional infighting that's going on. These people are going to knock down, drag out philosophical and possibly shooting war to be the ones to run the top of the pyramid when they think it all comes together.
Mm-hmm.
I really do think that's what's going on. I think, however, that said, that some of those elites, particularly in the West, have concluded that the attempt to build it bottom up on planet Earth
Mm-hmm.
isn't working. And what they're now planning to do is go out and build that global government structure and all of its institutions in space and then impose it on the Earth. I think that's part of the game plan with some of these people now.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the key there now is going to be to watch how various countries are trying to get in on the commercialization of space, number one,
Mm-hmm.
and number two, how they're trying to create actual governing structures for human colonies, permanent ones, in space, on the moon, on Mars, and so on and so forth. That's something I think to watch very, very closely.
You mentioned earlier Hungary, Orban?
Mm-hmm.
Do Putin and Orban represent a kind of, how should I put it, light at the end of the tunnel? Do we see hope in a Eurasian opposition, or is that Orwell's, basically revealing of the plan? I wonder at times if Orwell wasn't kind of maybe doing, this is just my theory, was he maybe doing psyops to basically put it out there like, oh, there's absolutely no opposition. If you ever try to oppose this, it's already planned that there would be a Eurasian Union and so forth. Or is it a real? I mean, surely people are going to be opposing globalism at some point. I mean, doesn't H.G. Wells even talk about kind of nationalist oppositions to the coming global government?
Mm-hmm. Um, I have to be very honest. I look at Putin's Russia as a very unique phenomenon.
Mm-hmm.
I view Russia as really the first postmodern state, because they've had their experience under Bolshevism with radical secular materialism, dialectical materialism, and all of that. They've had their experience with institutionalized atheism. They've had their experience with socialism, and it didn't work.
Mm-hmm.
And more importantly, it so gutted Russian culture
Mm-hmm.
and its Orthodox roots
Mm-hmm.
that the country was not functional, quite bluntly.
Right.
And I look at Putin and what he says and parse his words very, very carefully, because what he's really saying, if you listen to him carefully, is he's really saying, number one, the nation state is not obsolete. And number two, global corporations are not only not able to run it, they've attempted to run it in the last 30 years, and look what they've done. Mm-hmm. They've created nothing but chaos and misery. Mm-hmm. So he's re-articulating the idea of the value of the nation state from several points of view, in my opinion. He's articulating it from the standpoint of a check on unbridled corporate control. Because, let's face it, corporations have no Bill of Rights in their corporate charters.
Right.
That's problem number one. And he's also looking at it from the standpoint that what they do when they do run things to that extent, just like the old communist ministries and so on, is they have no room for culture. They have no room for expression. They have no room for creativity. Mm-hmm. And the only thing protective of that, in our experience, has been the nation state.
Right.
And he's articulating a cultural vision, in other words, that I think is very interesting. And Orban has picked this up. Mm-hmm. And what I think is very interesting now is that Britain has articulated its Brexit move. If you listen to some Brits who voted in favor of it, mm-hmm. they've articulated it in these kinds of cultural terms and national sovereignty terms.
Yes.
That I think is very, very interesting. To me, that indicates that there's some rethinking of this global agenda taking place on certain levels and on the part of certain factions within the global elite, that this game plan isn't working, and we might have to reconsider how we're going to go about doing this.
Some have suggested that if there were, as you mentioned, it was just a referendum with Britain, but if there were an actual withdrawal, it would really require a change in Germany to really be effective. And then, of course, Germany, as I understand, is still very much under CIA dominance. There's giant CIA facilities in Germany,
yes.
U.S. bases and so forth. So we would really have to see, a change there. Germany is really the hotspot, right?
Well, Germany, whether we like it or not, is the major power in Europe. Mm-hmm. And I think what you're going to see in Germany, you're already seeing it. You're seeing lender politicians, the state politicians in Germany, going off to Russia and making their own deals and simply bypassing Berlin. So what you're really seeing, I think, happening in the EU is the more they try and impose this bureaucratic, oligarchical superstructure mm-hmm. that is shoving multiculturalism of the most barbaric form down everybody's throats in total disregard of the wishes of various peoples in various nations there. What you're really seeing is the rebirth of tribalism. What really amazed me, Jay, is I saw this article recently, I think it was a couple days ago, where now Austria, get this, Austria, Slovakia, and Hungary are getting together to oppose the EU. So in other words, you're seeing the reemergence of Austria-Hungary in a certain sense as a bloc to pressure Brussels because they're not listening to tiny little Austria or tiny little Hungary or tiny little Slovakia. So maybe if we get back together, and coordinate all of this, they'll listen to us. You're seeing this happen in Europe, and I think if Europe survives, it's going to be due to some of these pressure groups being able to push through some reforms. Otherwise, they're either going to have to impose what they're trying to do now as just a total superstate dictatorship, or it's going to bust apart, which I think is ultimately going to happen anyway if they try to impose that, and Germany's going to pick up the pieces.
Yeah.
And at that point, I think the Germans, the Germans I've talked to have had it with the EU too, and they've certainly had it with the United States. They certainly don't want to go to war with Russia again. So, the Germans are going to pick up the pieces, and I think you're going to see a new kind of middle Europa in Europe, and you're going to see a reinvigoration of the old exchange rate mechanism. Only it's going to be much bigger and much more powerful than the old one. So, yeah, it's going to happen one way or the other. I think you're seeing the real philosophical divide boiling down to the centralist, globalist, central planners, everything managed, technocratic thing versus the decentralizers, the deregulators. If we're going to have all this, then let's have it in a way that everybody can exercise their creativity and not be dropping drones on millions of Muslims that haven't done anything to us. This is nuts.
Yeah, it is. So, are we looking at something post-imperium here? Is this post-empire? Is the liberal imperium of Western Atlanticism basically going to have to morph into something else? In other words, does it signal a real defeat, or does it signify a kind of temporary road bump, or is it a psyop? Is it a kind of bone thrown to the people to make them think that you can oppose this, you can really, that the system works, right? Like that you can vote your way out of something, which I'm very skeptical of voting anyway. But
me too. If it worked, they wouldn't let us do it.
Yeah, right.
The old George Carlin mantra. But no, I think it is a defeat, and a real one. I think it's less than a total defeat, but certainly more than just a bump in the road. The fact that the vote was allowed to go the way it did when they could have easily rigged it,
right, that's what I was wondering.
Yeah, means to me precisely that there's a segment now within the British deep state, within the Atlanticist elite, that is not happy with the way that things have been going, and are looking at the whole philosophy and program that has led to this point and saying, no, we've got to change our tack here. Otherwise, it's just, it's all going to blow up in our faces, maybe literally. I do think that this is genuine. I think you're going to see this type of Austro-Hungary version 2.0 spread. I think it's going to spread to this country. It's already happening if you know where to look and what to look for. It's already happening in a certain way, but I think it's going to spread, and it's going to spread very, very quickly. In other words, I don't think the Hillary Clinton, Donald Trump thing, Bernie Sanders thing is a psyop. I think they represent a real legitimate earthquake in the body politic.
Well, I think that from the vantage point of the people, they're reflections of real discontent. Absolutely.
Yeah, and that discontent, regardless of which of them enters the White House, although I would definitely have a few decimal points more loathing for one of them than the other two. But you could guess which one that is. But but anyway. I think regardless of what happens, it is not going to assuage the growing cynicism and awareness of people that things just are not working as advertised.
Exactly.
And I think at that point, you're going to see the same sorts of regionalism emerge in this country. There's talk of secession movements, the whole 9 yards is going on right now if you know where to dig. But I don't think it's going to take that form. I think it's going to take the form of an increasingly irrelevant paper entity, rather like the Holy Roman Empire.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's the way NATO is going to go. I think that's the way the federal government in this country is going to go. It's just going to be completely irrelevant, and people are not going to pay any attention to it. That's the way I see it happening. The only thing that scares me, quite frankly, Jay, is that the people in charge of the West, and in particular of this country, are so incredibly nuts
Mm-hmm.
that they might try to pull their bacon out of the fire and get us into a major war of some sort.
Yeah.
That's the thing that honestly and legitimately scares me.
Wow, great talk. So the book again is The Third Way, The Nazi International, European Union, and Corporate Fascism. Of course, there are numerous other Dr. Farrell books that I can recommend. SS Brotherhood of the Bell, that whole series, Secrets of the Unified Field. I haven't read it yet, but I just picked up Janus, Great Hermetic.
Thrice Great Hermetica and the Janus.
Yeah, Thrice Great Hermetica. Yeah, here on my shelf here, I'm looking at it. So I'm looking forward to that one. That was one that I didn't have. It's like collecting baseball cards or Garbage Pail Kids. I got to get them all, right?
Yeah, well, that's an interesting book. I just had another one come out about 9/11, and there's a couple of things in there relating to this fascist mafia international idea that I think will, if people aren't familiar with it, it'll rock their world.
Okay.
All I can say is when Catherine Fitz got that book, she called me up on the phone, and her first words were, "Oh my God!" She didn't know how else to react. She says, "I can't believe it." She says, "I don't believe you connected that dot." And I said, "I sure did," and I didn't want to, but I found it, and it's there, and. So anyway, yeah.
So your new 9/11 book is available now.
Yeah, it is available.
Okay.
I'll clue people in. I had to write The Third Way before I wrote that book.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, they are definitely related.
Okay. And the website is GizaDeathStar.com. You can find his work there. And the excellent geopolitical updates, news and views from the Nefarium, as well as many articles. So thank you, Dr. Farrell. Anything you want to leave us with?
Nope, thanks for having me back. Enjoyed it.
All right, thank you.